folks, I'm Matt, and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. Congress knows the Pentagon and the CIA are hiding this.
The United States government has gathered a great deal of information about UAPs over many decades, but has refused to share it with the American people. That is wrong, and additionally, it breeds mistrust. We've also been notified by multiple credible sources that information on UAPs has also been withheld from Congress, which, if true, is a violation of the laws requiring full notification to the legislative branch, especially as it relates to the 4 congressional leaders, the defense committees, and the intelligence committee. So the bill I worked on with Senator Rounds offered a common sense solution.
Last year, Congress attempted to pass the UAP Disclosure Act of 2024, forcing the CIA and the Pentagon to reveal to Congress what they know about UAPs, otherwise known as UFOs. Now, the act was gutted last year by Republican Mike Turner, but fortunately, this bill has been reintroduced as the UAP Disclosure Act of 2025, sponsored by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Senator Mike Rounds, and co-sponsored, by the way, by Senators Heinrich and Gillibrand. Today we have Washington, D.C. lobbyist and founder of Declassify UAP, Nick Gold, joining us to discuss how you can ensure the UAP Disclosure Act of 2025 passes. But first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons on YouTube. Leave a comment and let us know what you think about this episode. You can also find us on X at Good Trouble Show and all other social media platforms at The Good Trouble Show. You can also find us wherever you enjoy your podcasts. Search for The Good Trouble Show with Matt Ford. And as always, we need your help keeping the lights on. You can become a Patreon member of The Good Trouble Show. Go to www.patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. Sign up and you can support our work. And let's see. Finally, let's get right to it. So today's guest is a registered federal lobbyist who believes it is past time for the U.S. government to come clean with Congress and the American people on the existence of UAPs. Please welcome the founder of Declassify UAP, Nick Gold. Nick, how are you, sir?
I'm great, Matt. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a real honor.
Thanks for coming on the show. So you've been a registered lobbyist for how long? This is like your main job, right?
Well, yeah, I took a break from my normal career path, which was in media information technology. I actually registered and put in the paperwork to become a registered federal lobbyist, which is not an insurmountable task. People can do this. It doesn't cost any money. You have to kind of read up on the requirements and everything and fill out some paperwork and such with both the House and the Senate. I actually did that on the day after the major UAP hearing in Congress last year, which I was able to attend in person. I woke up super early, took the MARC commuter train down from Baltimore to DC, was able to just squeak into the room, sitting there 10 feet away from history being made. It was pretty amazing. And I had already had the idea in my head. I was already starting to build out the website, a lot of the content, the capabilities of declassifyuap.org. But it was actually the day after that I put in the registration, which was interesting. I didn't really think ahead. Turns out Politico, their kind of beat reporter for lobbying, just looks at the registrations that go in on a regular basis. And they saw after this kind of historic event that I had just stood this thing up. And the reporter there reached out to me and I got a Politico story. I got a couple appearances on News Nation. So it was a great kickoff for the effort and very timely because, again, we had that very significant historical event in the House UAP hearing last year with, of course, Grusch, Fravor, and Graves. And it was a perfect time to kick it off. And then the website really officially launched about September 1st last year.
Awesome, and I want to get into more details of what you're up to. But I'm curious, what is it like navigating politics in Washington, just separate of the whole UAP issue?
So I mentioned in my professional career it was media technology related. I helped every type of organization you can think of, including government agencies, but also private sector, in the media world, but also things that aren't directly in the media world, but work with media, largely in the DC area. I helped them manage their media collections and organize them and store them and move media around. And so I had an opportunity in my career to work with all sorts of different types of groups that are tied both to government and politics, lobbyists, nonprofits, think tanks, environmental groups, PACs, super PACs, the whole kit and caboodle. And I worked with, frankly, organizations all across the spectrum, some really well-known ones, including some political campaigns, major organizations, things that people probably have immediate reactions to if I were to say them out loud. But it was really like I ran the gamut. And so I got to work with many types of organizations generating political media, generating political messaging, and got to see it up close at some very pivotal moments over the last 15 to 20 years. And, what's it like? It's hard to say, but it's interesting. Everyone there is a human being. They're all people, right? They all respond to the incentive structures that have been set up for them and that they're kind of dialed into. The fact that I was able to successfully do business and consult with every type of org, every type of ideology, every type of movement that's going on, with some exceptions, of course, but many of them. I guess the reason I was successful in that is because I treated them all like normal human beings who wanted to be respected and wanted to, have someone who was thoughtful, helping them out with their issues of the day, their challenges. And in a sense, I guess you could say I look at the UAP issue similarly. It's an issue that transcends the more just tactical, type of stuff that happens in DC. It's a big picture item. I think that's why it's attracted a lot of bipartisan attention, which is obviously really rare in Washington these days. And, everyone I interact with in that realm is informed by all of the types of players that I worked with in my professional career. And it's, I generally want to treat people with respect. I think they should engage with topics and individuals respectfully. I try to be honest and truthful and represent myself and my feelings and beliefs about things and be very kind of intellectually and emotionally honest about what my beliefs are and my feelings versus what I know to be true and what can be kind of scientifically validated. And the response generally on both sides of the aisle has been very positive to that. Obviously, we have our sticking points. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned one of the names that people are probably aware of if they follow this as a political issue. So there's clearly some resistance that needs to be worked through. But in that spirit of being open to working with all types, I feel I can kind of help at least bring that a bit to the UAP topic. And even where there are some sticking points that we need to work through, potentially at least be part of the solution of bringing people together so we can kind of move on with much more important business, which is kind of wrapping our heads together around this very interesting but unique topic.
It is interesting and it is unique. That is for sure. So I'm curious, Nick, at what age did you become interested in UAP? And then also, when did you realize that these things are pretty much 100% real?
So it's an interesting question. I became aware of this, as a child in the 80s watching science fiction movies. I was watching some updates on my Facebook, all the movies that came out in the summer of 86. It was like all these crazy greats. Aliens just, was the anniversary of it hitting the theaters. There was Flight of the Navigator. There was the Transformers animated movie. And so much of the themes of my childhood and those kinds of media interests had to do with beings from other planets and cyborgs and Terminator. Just every type of thought imaginable, right? And so I also, in elementary school, came to the understanding that UFOs were something people reported as seeing and whatever. And I have to say, I've said this before to people, I think it was seeing the movie Flight of the Navigator at my buddy's 8th birthday party. It's a very visceral movie. It holds up really well, in my opinion. And, I really identified with the main character, David, in the movie, the little geeky, brown-haired kid or whatever. And I just remember there's that famous, shot in Flight of the Navigator of him being back in the seat. And that was, me in the theater watching this.
Yeah.
I don't think I've been the same since, frankly. And I'll tell you, Matt, for whatever reason, again, I'm one of those people who's had some interesting thoughts and ideas about things since I was in elementary school. UFOs were one of them, consciousness, non-dualism, a lot of things were flowing through me. And so, not long after, I think, I became aware of the concept of UAP. For me personally, it, again, my own just impression,
Sure.
it was very easy for me to understand that this was actually real. Like clearly serious people had been interested in it. There was clearly government interest. Anyone who reads like one serious book on the topic can kind of get that sensibility. Even decades ago, that was clear. And so it just was never difficult for me to imagine that this was a real thing. I've always thought that Earth is a really interesting place. I'm kind of enjoying my experience here.
Same, yeah.
Strange. And like, it just wasn't weird for me to imagine that maybe this place would be interesting to other types of people too. Folks from further away or a little more removed from our day-to-day lives. But like, yeah, there would be plenty to be interested about here. And I took for granted that there's probably, things out there that are much more advanced than we are, just because of how long things have been around. You just look at the last 50 to 100 years of human history, and you're like, well, what would that be like in 10,000 years, 100,000 years? So, like, it just felt logically to me possible or entirely probable that people were really seeing these things. And, I later learned that there were some occurrences, fairly proximate to me that I don't know to what degree I was interacting with without having a clear memory of. But this vibe was sort of close by, I guess you could say. And so maybe that was part of it too. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny, the more people that I bring this topic up with, like, maybe like 5 years ago or whatever, I would like never bring it up because I knew people would look at you funny. But now I engage with people on this all the time, and I am pleasantly surprised how many people say, you know what, when I was 9 years old, I had, I saw this up in the sky. It's like I've found that there are actually a lot of folks that have had encounters with UAP. So, you're not alone. I would venture to say probably 75% of the people that I bring this up to have had some kind of experience. Now, as you mentioned, you founded Declassify UAP. Give us a little bit more detail as far as what you're doing and how this is working into this legislation, the UAP Disclosure Act of 2025.
I mentioned all of the different types of organizations in Washington that I worked with over all these years. Again, nonprofits, lobbyists, PACs, you name it. There's those types of organizations for every side of every issue that exists as a political issue in the Washington, D.C. sphere. And, I wasn't seeing those types of orgs for getting concrete, movement happening on the UAP declassification side, the real kind of governmental processes that I am pushing for. These exist for every other issue. I mean, you name it, environment, guns, this, that. There's big buildings filled with people with shiny glass fronts and, nice waiting rooms. And there was really very little to nothing. There was a couple of 501c3, science-related orgs, pursuing UAP, other things like that, but very little like citizen, grassroots, activism, citizen engagement. And that seemed to be a really big missing piece to me because clearly there was several years of, even decades, but more recently, years of high-level government insiders making moves. Obviously, we have Chris Mellon and Lue Elizondo and the folks from the hearing last year and others. And now we have multiple former DNIs, which is the highest intelligence community position in the government, saying this is real and potentially something pretty far out. Former CIA directors. But what I observed was that issues don't tend to make a lot of progress in DC unless there's also sort of like the groundswell of support from actual humans who vote for elected officials. And so there needed to be an org, like a Save the Whales for UAP or a Black Lives Matter. I mean, it needed like a catchy phrase like that just said what it's trying to do, declassify UAP, which I was like shocked. No one had any of the domains. No one had any of the social media accounts. Every variation was available to me to just kind of pin down. I was like, well, I guess I'm supposed to be declassify UAP, or at least start that as a meme, really. Like, okay, there needs to be like a call to action. What are we going to do? Like save the whales, declassify the UAP. So I thought about, what it would take to start that. I was in a position to kind of take a little bit of a break from my normal, revenue generating professional career, because this is definitely not that, nor do I see it as that at this point.
Right.
So I was able to kind of step back, research, starting an LLC, which it's formulated as, which is very common for kind of lobbyist and grassroots advocacy groups. Look into all of the registering as a lobbyist requirements and legislation. Stand up a website, find a web designer, design a logo, all of this stuff. And then, of course, I single-handedly wrote all of the copy for the website, all of the information that's presented, because presenting really grounded information through the site was important to me. Information that doesn't take a firm stance that this is this, and this is how you have to think about it. I wanted it to be like, the truth, we can handle it, we deserve it, give us the truth wherever that leads. Here's information that's been presented to us. Here are government reports. Here's what some high-level insiders have said, not even just whistleblowers, but high-level government officials. Here's presentations they've released. Here's data slides, and make it seem really real, like a typical issue that has reality to it. I had a great political advertising company that I had done some business with in the past, who, strangely, I think are probably like in either the office building that Lue Elizondo describes in Imminent or like next to it, because it was like overlooking the Pentagon. And I just thought it was ironic that I had the ad produced by a company that was like literally as close as you can get to the Pentagon. And wanted to have a really snappy video piece that kind of announced the campaign and looked like a professional political ad, just to kind of normalize all of this. And I sunk my resources into it. I got it stood up. Ross Coulthart actually kind of gave the announcement on September 1st, thereabouts last year. I had let him preview the site, and he kind of put the blurb out, and it was like, okay, we're doing this. And of course, it has the entire system we can talk about more, but allowing actual voters to engage with their own elected officials as constituents. I wanted the clean website that had like the standard little form you fill out. Like, I want to message my congressman. I got to fill out a few fields. Here's my name. Here's my address. Check a checkbox or don't check a checkbox and hit blah. And in 30 seconds, send a few messages out to my House congressional rep, my 2 senators, the president, the vice president, and get the word out to them that we just want to see reasonable declassification around this topic. It's time to level with the public. Again, the catchphrase, and I was really glad to see it actually in Imminent, Americans deserve the truth about UAP, and we can handle the truth about UAP. And so it's time to make that happen.
So let's dig into that a little bit more. Why should this issue be important to the American voter that is, maybe right now just focused on putting food on the table? Why should the average American that doesn't track this topic should care about this topic?
Well, most Americans, if not all Americans that I know, care about government transparency. They feel that, again, even whether they support government or they're fairly anti-government and they're wired that way, however they feel, wherever they are in that spectrum of beliefs about governance, they want to see the government operate in a way that's for the people, by the people, the standard premise that our entire system is based on. And everyone wants government transparency. People want the government to be working for their interests. And cover-ups don't help with that. We've had a lot of cover-ups in the history of even just the 20th century, getting involved in the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, and the Pentagon Papers release, Tuskegee syphilis studies, MK Ultra, like all this crappy stuff that has been done, frankly, in our names, that has over the decades, I think, eroded a lot of Americans' trust in government and have just this attitude like there's an us versus them, there's the inside the Beltway folks and the outside the Beltway. And I've worked in and out of the Beltway. They are really just other human beings. And so we want to see a government that respects its people. And this issue, which I believe is absolutely real, and lots of people can attest to that and is important for just even understanding the nature of our reality and science and where we fit into the universe. These are fundamental questions we have as humans.
Sure.
We've been asking these questions for thousands of years. Like, who are we? Why are we here? How do we connect with the universe? What's our place in things? Is there a meaning to it all? I think people connect to the UAP topic because it intones those kinds of questions and even maybe dangles potential answers. But at the same time, if the government were to open up about something like this, and acknowledge that there has indeed been some level of cover-up, even if that was mostly for good reasons, at least initially. Maybe I won't agree with those reasons, but I think people probably sincerely engaged during the height of the Cold War, immediately after World War II, in the way that they were capable of. I mean, people try to do the best they can do. I generally believe that. And so, I just think that if we can get to truth on this topic, and if the government can acknowledge what at least they understand to be what's going on, the amount of benefit we will have across our society and people kind of understanding, sometimes government really messes up. Sometimes it's not representing our interests. Sometimes it does things and these patterns reiterate for decades and decades and it gets really stale and it's not working. Wow. They fixed this, or at least they're making strides. They take it seriously. They respect me as a citizen. They're respecting me as a grown-up, an adult who can handle the truth about something like this. I think symbolically, it could be a very important part of frankly, the healing that our society needs to go through right now. I think most Americans, again, despite their feelings about things, think that there is some healing in America that needs to happen. And one of those things is how we feel about the government. And so just the amount of sort of solve or medicine that this could provide to allowing people to even think it's possible to reform government, I think could be very useful as we then approach all sorts of other issues that are really important, that need us to feel that that's possible in order for us to engage with those issues in a meaningful way. So hopefully UAP is like a gateway drug for some people as far as getting them more involved with government.
That would be great. Now, folks at home may not realize this, but Congress has enacted federal legislation on UAPs, UFOs over the past few years. Could you walk us through some of that legislation that is now federal law, and also who put that legislation forward?
Yeah, and let me be really clear, because this began really in 2020 with the FY21 Intelligence Authorization Act. And since then, and I'll get into some of the details in a moment, Matt, but we've had now 4 solid years of legislative wins at the federal level, with high-level Congress people in the House and Senate side being involved, to push forward meaningful legislation to create more transparency around the UAP topic in government. And that's both transparency for Congress themselves, and then by extension, transparency for the public. So I just want to emphasize for one moment that there are many other causes that have tried to get legislation passed, have tried to make change in DC, and sometimes have gone decades without a single bill getting passed, a single law being changed. And they fight and they fight and they stick with it. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes not so much. I mean, look at gun control legislation in this country. Look at so many other issues, basic healthcare stuff. I mean, people fight for decades for some very basic stuff. We've now had 4 years of real meaningful change on the UAP front. People should open their eyes wide and say, that's amazing. That's huge. That represents a trend line that looks really, really good right now, and we need to stick with it. So it began with the Intelligence Authorization Act of FY21, which gets merged typically into the National Defense Authorization Act. Defense being a little more like DoD side, and then the intel stuff obviously being the intelligence community related stuff. And so it was Marco Rubio, I believe, who actually put a little bit into the FY21 IAA that said the government needed to produce a report on UAP. He had clearly been hearing there was something here, paying attention to Lue Elizondo, maybe engaging with some of these folks. And all it needed to do was generate a report. I think it stipulated both a classified and an unclassified version, because I think these representatives want the public to have some access at least to this thinking. That's important to them. And so that is what led to the UAP task force report that came out. It was like the first government report on UAP in years. And it was probably the best of the last several years worth of legislation, or I should say reports, because the UAP task force of what we know now is that the people involved, like Jay Stratton and whatnot, took it very seriously. Not so much like the current office, at least as far as their public comms go, but it seems the UAP task force was really interested in trying to get more accurate information out there within the confines of the classification that exists around the topic. So we got that report, and that started now over the last 3 years to stimulate additional legislation. So this is legislation that then mandated additional regular reports on the topic that have been getting generated, first by, well, DOD stood up this little office that I call AOMSIG. It has a really weird
AIMSOG or whatever, yeah.
It essentially morphed into what's now the Aero office. So you can kind of think of them as the same beast. But, they started generating regular reports. Some of them have been better than others. The history report was mandated. Unfortunately, it was garbage and really poorly done. But it started to show, and this was really reinforced in FY22, FY23, and we'll get more into FY24, last year's legislation in a few when we talk about the UAPDA. But it started to introduce like all of this congressionally mandated legislation, all these requirements for how DOD specifically and some other federal agencies need to start sharing more information on a regular basis about UAP with Congress, including in a classified setting, but then also to try to inform the public as best as possible, given current classification limitations, as to what's going on here. And they have produced these reports per the legislation somewhat regularly. They've put out some other kind of like slideshow, like presentation type documents, that some of which have actually been pretty interesting, like the Aero UAP data slide that people have seen, which has the little heat map of encounters and altitudes and a little table in the middle that describes some commonly seen UAP characteristics. Interesting that they don't talk about the outlier UAP characteristics, because that's what most people are interested in.
Of course.
Is the far out ones. But it started to give us something that said these things are real, they're being seen. And by the way, they largely look and behave like the same things that people have been reporting on in government since 1948's Project Sign. Like, it hasn't really changed very much, which tells us something. Like,
it tells you a lot.
I think.
It tells you that by and large, we're not talking about Russian or Chinese drones.
It doesn't seem so, because if you really look at where Russia and China were in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and today in Ukraine and other things, like, it just doesn't fit with their military capabilities, their ISR capabilities. It doesn't fit with our own. It's, again, our technologies have changed dramatically in an 80-year period. These things aren't really changing. They look like geometric objects flying around at hypersonic speeds. It's like, we don't do that really. So anyway, going back to the legislation, last year's was more, starting to get even more meaningful with the UAP Disclosure Act. But this is now 4 years. We'll probably get some wins this year as well. So half a decade now, where every year Congress is passing more and more important UAP transparency legislation. And again, we just need to bask in that. We need to take the wins, because
absolutely,
when we say, oh, it was gutted and nothing happened, or that's, first of all, it's not accurate, but it also just reinforces like a lot of negative thinking. It doesn't keep the momentum going. Getting things done in Washington is all about keeping your foot on the accelerator and keeping momentum going. And that means taking the wins and then championing the wins and saying, okay, these are the next wins we're going for. Like, you have to kind of negotiate from a position of strength, so to speak. And when we bellyache about what's not happening, even though a lot of things are happening, it takes away our ability to negotiate from a position of strength. And so we want to get more wins. We want to get the full UAPDA passed. We got some of it last year, a huge win. But we got to kind of keep at it and celebrate all of the progress that we've been making.
And one of the things I want to point out is that, as a lobbyist, you understand how political capital works in Washington. So there's no way, would you agree with this? There is no way that Congress would expend the amount of political capital, these lawmakers, there's no way they would spend their political capital on something that they think might be a fantasy, right?
So the short answer is no, they wouldn't typically do that. Now, let me be a little more nuanced. There are plenty of people in politics today who make fantastical thinking the centerpiece of their political messaging.
Yes, they do.
So it happens. However, It happens with sort of the issues of the day, and issues that they already know they have constituencies around that feel certain ways, and those are the people who are going to probably vote for them in their primaries and in their general elections in their district and give them money and all of these things. UAP is kind of adjacent to all of this. It's not something that, like, 5 years ago people were clamoring, like, you need to do this, and yet And again, I largely will thank some of the insiders who have put a lot of their time, energy, personal resources into doing real behind the scenes lobbying in Congress. People are like, why wasn't Lue Elizondo in front of Congress at the hearing? Lue Elizondo has been in front of Congress so much over the last 7 years. It's like he's probably spent more time with those Congress people than almost anybody, and Chris Mellon and these other folks. So they built up a state where I think a lot of reps realized there was truth to this. Whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a member of the GOP, the Republican Party, everyone in those parties likes to message around the fact that the government should be working for you, the voter. Some people lean more heavily into the government can never work for you, the voter. Some people lean more into like, we need to make the government something that works for us. Our own efforts define that. However, the commonality there is that the government not doing that well with potentially a really important issue that a lot of people care about. Many Americans are really interested in this topic. They realize they have something to gain by incorporating it into their larger messaging, even if their messaging around UAP still kind of falls along their partisan lines, perhaps. Maybe it fits into like, don't trust the government, or maybe it fits into we need to improve the government. But whatever that is, they've been able to incorporate it in a way that doesn't really jeopardize the rest of their political brand that they've been developing. So I think that's partly why we've been able to get such bipartisan support around it. And so they definitely take it seriously. Like, there's no question. I mean, just last year, you gave a clip of it. Schumer and Rounds, when they did their colloquy on the floor of the Senate, I mean, they're being very blunt. They didn't have to do that. And they said it in stark terms. The legislation that they're drafting is in stark terms. So they clearly, it even says this in the legislation. They take this seriously. They have reasons to take it seriously. They've learned things about what's going on here that need to be rectified. So there's no question that they think this is for real. And it just reinforces something I try to get out there. There's a lot of noise in UFO world. And there's always like the naysayers and the doubters and, the skeptics and this and the that. And the thing I would love for people to realize is those people aren't actually highly relevant to the conversation at this point. The grown-ups in the room know what's going on. They really do. And we don't have to spend half of our cycles dealing with the folks who are just repeating the same talking points that have been reiterated for 75 years. We can just focus our energies on the grown-ups in the room. A lot of them won't agree with us. A lot of them still need to be educated about the topic. But we can put our focus there, and I think it will lead to much more productivity. And at the end of the day, people who thought this was BS, they're going to be a little side note in the history books, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's going to be asterisks, designed the Tony Hawk video game and was wrong about UAP.
Right. Yeah, Mr. Pet Siegel himself. Now, at the top of the show, and we've been talking about this, obviously, I spoke about last year's UAP Disclosure Act, the 2024 version. So what, for the viewers that are totally new to this, what was in that act and what survived out of it? Now, I admit I've been saying I was gutted and whatnot, so why is my characterization maybe a little bit harsh, but more importantly, what was in it and what was left over, or not left over, but what passed?
No. And I want to be really clear and validate your view. Like, certain key elements, which we'll get to in a moment, were removed, and you could say gutted. It's a fair word for it. However, some really important stuff did make it, and I think we need to emphasize that kind of both is often the answer. It's like, yeah, it was gutted, but yeah, it also got some useful things done. How do we bring those two views together to get more useful things done over this year, next year, the following year? And we really have to be invested in this as a topic, not from a 6-month perspective, not what's going to happen in the current year of Congress, not what's going to happen in, our House changes over every 2 years. So every 2 years, there's like a very new set of possibilities just on the House side. So I think we just always need to be willing to look at, again, the wins, but really understand specifically what didn't make it in, so we know what we're pushing our elected officials for to get to the kind of the end point that we're trying to get to. So the UAPDA covered a bunch of interesting areas. I mentioned that it kind of begins with the senators who put it together and led it last year and are doing so this year, saying that there's like a reason for this. These are things that they have come to know, again, through some of those interfacing with insiders and top-level government people and military people and intelligence people. They know that this hasn't been handled well. And just even getting that kind of language into our legal system on the books, I think is really important. And some of that didn't really make it in. One of the big requirements, and this did make it in, was for the National Archives, which is technically the National Archives and Records Administration, to create a UAP record repository, somewhat akin, especially in the original legislation, the original UAPDA, it was supposed to be akin to how the JFK records collection was put together. And you can go to the NARA website, and you can go to the JFK records collection and see that there was something like, I think it's 5 million pages of documents that were released. It's like over 200,000 individual files. JFK researchers have gone through that stuff for years now and found all sorts of really wild stuff in it that has filled out our picture of the JFK assassination quite a bit. Who was this Lee Harvey Oswald guy? Some sketchy stuff he was involved with, including with our own government. It really did help a lot of understanding around that, even if it's not definitive necessarily. So NARA, National Archives, was supposed to put together, and they have now, because this did make it in last year, a repository for UAP. And you can go to Google National Archives UAP Records Collection, hit enter, you'll see it pop right up. You can go to it. And in fact, some government agencies have already started sending National Archives records that have been cleared to release to the public, some of which have been digitized, and you can go through, and they even have like a film or a video of a film of apparently some space weapons test and like a UAP coming into the frame and interacting with their missile or whatever. So there's really some interesting stuff that's already started to pop up there. And the goal of the UAPDA was to kind of create an enforcement mechanism, a little bit of a police force, if you will, for federal agencies to have some impetus to getting those records over to NARA. And that was going to be kind of this review board. And it was going to be a number of independent people who are selected through government, but they can't have had any association with the UAP topic in the rest of their career and have kind of a vested interest. And like for the JFK Records Act, they were supposed to kind of investigate the topic, be given super level clearances that would give them access to everything relevant entirely, and then start to make recommendations to the president directly about what should get declassified and what they might need to hold back on for legitimate national security reasons. And again, the police force element, that review board didn't make it in, but the NARA records collection did. And that's why you can go to NARA's website and go to the UAP records. And that is going to probably start to get more and more filled out from October onward, October this year, because the law said every federal agency, civilian, military, intelligence, needs to send every UAP-related record they have, every document, every piece of media, everything they have, to National Archives starting this October. It's going to be reviewed. The impetus will be on declassifying things that are 25 years old or older as the priority, which is typical for government declassification efforts. And they're going to start to put them up. And I was able to actually talk to a group that I didn't even know existed a few months ago called the Public Interest Declassification Board that kind of interfaces both with the president and with NARA. They have open meetings periodically, and they had one at Archives in DC that I was invited to. And, I got to kind of talk to the people on the Public Interest Declassification Board, representatives from the Department of State and the DoD who help with their declassification systems and efforts. Everyone knew about the law. Everyone knew NARA is supposed to be receiving these records. They've started their review processes. They're going through that stuff. There's certainly going to be some asks for extensions and exemptions and all of that, which is normal. But everyone was totally aware that this law had passed. You go to the NARA page for UAP, and it talks about the law that was passed, which is why you're on that page. So that was a huge portion. We didn't get the review board, which we really need to push for. There was a few other key elements. There was a statement that made explicit that the U.S. federal government has what's called eminent domain over any recovered UAP materials that private sector entities may have in their possession. Now, some folks took this to mean they're like little UAP potentially related, scrap metal collections. And that I don't think was like the intent. They're not going after Jacques Vallée's little UAP parts or Gary Nolan's. This was about like if Lockheed has a craft, like
Yes.
the government should have the right to take possession of it. And again, eminent domain doesn't mean they will. It means they have the right to. Now, that was pretty controversial because eminent domain as just an ideological concept does not fly with most people who are self-described conservatives in this country. It's a thing. The government has eminent domain because what eminent domain really speaks to is power. It really is about power and who has agency and who can exercise power. And so, like, in the same way that if your local government wants to build a new train line through your section of town, they can exercise eminent domain and come up with a reasonable way of compensating you, but moving you out of there so they can put that train line down or whatever they need to do. So eminent domain is something that's exercised, and most people don't really debate. Governments at various levels of our system have the ability to enact or to kind of take advantage of. But apparently that was pretty controversial, both with folks who kind of have their collections of stuff and don't want the government swooping in, even though it seemed pretty obvious that that's not what the situation was. That's not what the intent of that was. But, this is my own feeling. If the government genuinely feels a private sector contractor has a potentially dangerous recovered object that has a power supply that makes nuclear energy look like a joke or whatever, all of the existing regulations, including the inherent eminent domain, exist that really probably allow the U.S. government to come in and swoop it away if they want to. And that is, I assume, the case today. It's like they have ability. At the end of the day, power is at the end of a gun barrel, and the government has that power. So I don't know if that needs to be as explicitly stated in the law, but that might have presented some hangups, and that got struck. And then I think the other main component that I was excited about is that the original UAPDA spoke to a government-wide and even international UAP disclosure effort. I mean, it really was like the legal definition of government UAP disclosure was baked into the law. And it talked about high-level government officials, working towards these ends, reaching out to their international colleagues in other countries and encouraging them to also increase their transparency with both their people and the people of the world around what they know around this topic, because there's a lot of presumption, Russia and China and a number of others know what's up with UAP. And so I would love to see that make it in as well. It doesn't seem terribly controversial in the scheme of things. And it's like it really embodied in a legalistic framework government UFO disclosure. So I'd love to see that component make it in this year. And again, they're battling right now about what additional elements of UAPDA that didn't pass in December of last year might make its way into the FY25 NDAA this year, which we're right in the midst of some important processes around.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to bring up is that, again, going back to this whole eminent domain thing, if a Russian satellite crashes on Skinwalker Ranch, the government can declare that area a national security site and pick up that Russian satellite. This whole idea that this eminent domain thing, as you mentioned, is so people can go on to recover and pick up whatever is buried under the mesa at Skinwalker Ranch. That is not the intent. It is not the intent whatsoever, nor is it the intent to go and to go to Jacques Vallée and take his metamaterial away.
You just stated it so well, Matt. I really appreciate you putting it in those terms. We have a real world situation from just last year we can think about. A Chinese spy balloon traversed a huge portion of the continental United States, as well as Alaska and other areas, for days and days. We know that it had monitoring equipment. It was the size of a freaking school bus. Its framework under the balloon. I mean, it was a significant apparatus. And there was questions about whether they should shoot it down while it was still over the mainland. They ended up waiting. So I think mostly out of safety concerns, it was over the water and the recovery would be a little easier. But the reality is, if the U.S. government had chosen to take out a Chinese spy balloon, that was coming across America, and it happened to land in some subdivision, the idea that anyone would question whether the government, the feds, would have any a right to come in and claim it, no one would question that.
Exactly, because they do.
Obviously, they can do that.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
the moment it's something even more potentially dangerous, far out, there's risks to it. It could be weaponized. It could irradiate people and be literally a danger to their health, that they wouldn't have the right to come in and claim it at any moment, like permanently. Like, it's ludicrous. But it's also why maybe, if that were to get negotiated away and you give some of the opponents that, maybe you can do a little horse trading and say, well, then we want this part and this part in, and you got to give it to that. Give us that. And again, we know some of that horse trading occurred last year because we did get the NARA records repository for UAP. So I think we need to look at the UAPDA as like a punch list, like a checklist. And we can say, okay, these are the key elements. We just, took your viewers through some of them. We got a big one. We have a few more key ones, and then there's some that are maybe less of a priority. And we just, every year, we need to check more and more of it off, because the thing that people don't understand is that we live in a government. We live in a modern bureaucracy in the year 2024. We live in a very legalistic society. If it's not written down, it's not on paper, it doesn't have signatures, it might as well not be real. We've set up our entire world this way. And these types of frameworks, it's interesting. I think the impetus in government, largely, like the main thrust right now, is to be more transparent around this topic. I think most leaders in government are ready to do this, including high-level intelligence and DoD officials. I think there's finally room for shift to happen. And yet, these frameworks are an essential part of that process, because they need their own, lane markers to kind of travel down as they try to go through this process. And they're in the habit of following things that are in legal documents or in procedural manuals or this or that. I mean, it's how our world works, especially in defense and intelligence and law. And so, they need this to help them do what they're already maybe somewhat inclined to already do. And that's why getting the legislation passed and giving them that bureaucratic framework that is like, okay, this is how our society came together to decide we want to do this. It's a lot easier even for the president to have that document and then do something than not have that document and not quite know how to go about something. And, I don't think a president is going to want to declassify UAP totally unilaterally. They have that power. They could do it. Joe Biden could declassify UAP tomorrow. However, even if he wanted to, and I think people need to be very aware of this, because it could be the case. Even if Joe Biden today thinks that the public deserves more information about UAP, a person in the political realm like Joe Biden, who's been working with legislation in Congress for decades and decades, his entire career, even he needs the legal framework to give him the capital to work with, as I said, the sort of guidelines. And that's why it's so important for us to pass, although I think the momentum is already very much on our side.
I think so as well. How it was explained to me, the eminent domain, why it is in there, is that it is the legal guarantor that that this panel, this White House-based panel, it basically legally mandates any private defense contractor or publicly traded contractor, just any defense contractor, period, it legally mandates that they open the door and say, this is what we have. It doesn't mean that they're going to come in and take it, but without that language in there, essentially Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Aerospace Corporation can say, you know what, this is our private property. We don't have to open the garage door and show you a thing. That eminent domain language is necessary in order for the panel to be able to see what they are holding on to. That is the reason it is there.
No, I think you're completely correct, and I think that is reasonable. And again, listen, if we can get it in there, I say we take it, because as I was just talking about, anything that stipulates in literal legalistic terms what a framework is for doing something makes it easier for people in government to do that. And that includes the review board and getting access to materials. However, I'll just present this way of thinking about it. First of all, we've had incremental wins for the last several years, and there's no reason to think we can't have more incremental wins over the coming years. Like every issue that is serious, There can be years and years worth of legislation that builds up around it. So I don't personally believe we have to look at it like all or nothing, as we've talked about already. Like we can get partial portions of this. So the way I think about it is, yes, making sure those review board members have even physical access to those kind of things, like let me into the warehouse from Flight of the Navigator so I can see this thing floating with the tarps over it, or whatever the reality is. I mean, it might not be anything like that. Or they might not have things at all. I don't really know because I don't have the clearances to know. And I wouldn't say if I did, because I believe in security clearances for the most part. But, here's the thing. That's not all the information that exists in the US federal government about UAP, is the actual objects potentially sitting in a contractor's, warehouse somewhere, or sub-basement, B14 or whatever. Like, there's all sorts of government records about UAP that exist, including in the pure government realm at the agency level. There could well be recovered objects purely in the government realm at the agency level. In fact, that was kind of implied in the Canadian memo that was released last year in the wake of the February 2023 UAP shootdowns. We know something was shot down and had begun its exploitation process because of the memo to Trudeau that said that was occurring. It's not what the public heard at the time, but we learned this retroactively. So, the idea that every single bit of hard UAP evidence has made its way exclusively into some, private sector repository that's completely inaccessible to government, I don't buy it. Like a lot of, I've worked with government as a contractor, or rather, as a company that did contracting. And when you walk through three-letter federal agencies, half the people, at least in those buildings, typically are what you'd call a green badger. You either have a blue badge or a green badge when you're walking around in those places. The blue badge means you're a government employee. The green badge means you're a contractor. And again, easily as many people are contractors in those buildings as blue badgers. And that's true both in the federal buildings, that's true at Air Force bases. To some degree, that's even true at those private sector organizations' own properties. You have mixes of both governmental and non-governmental people working on programs. And so the idea that there's been this completely hard cutoff and some things are completely inaccessible to government because they've been totally locked up in the private sector, it just doesn't quite fit with what my own experiences have been in government and contracting, including with certain federal agencies. It would probably be very mixed. There's still probably people with badges on their chest, if they're the right people with the right read-ins, that can access those things, even if it's in a pick your contractor, name, to insert. But whether it's theoretically a Lockheed or a Northrop Grumman or whatever, to me, it just seems obvious that there are certain people who can still get to that even as government people. So, I agree. I think it would be a very useful tool for them. But here's something that doesn't require that. What's the current, and this is one of the declassification targets I stipulate on the website at declassifyuap.org. I have this whole section called declassification targets, which is the main 7 things I would like to see more transparency around sooner rather than later. And one of them is, what are the intelligence assessments about UAP? When you actually have a TSSCI compartmented clearance and you get read in and they say, okay, this is actually our assessment of these, especially the highly anomalous UAP. What's the assessment? What's the president told? What are the DNI directors told? What are the CIA directors told? They're clearly being told something, because I don't think James Brennan would go on a podcast interview and squirm around and talk about how UAP might represent another form of life if that was just based on his own ideas about UAP.
Exactly.
Or Avril Haines, or Ratcliffe, or more recently, or actually even did it last year, Clapper, who gets mentioned several times in Lue Elizondo's new book. Clapper literally was on CNN and said, there could have been kind of crimes. I think he was speaking proverbially, but crimes around the UAP cover-up. He acknowledged his role in that, and I think took some real responsibility for that in a way that we don't tend to see, but was really refreshing.
Yes.
And it's they're getting read in on some intelligence assessment. It seems to, I think, keep on the table some pretty amazing, possibilities that even those types of people in government are hearing. If we got just that little bit declassified, and let's say hypothetically it does say, we think there's a chance that some of these could be some form of non-human intelligence or technology. Think about the political capital that being declassified would give Congress the following year to get even more stringent regulations pushed through, because now we've learned there's a reality to this, and this is the government assessment. So I don't know if getting access to physical recovered craft has to be in the first round or even couple of rounds of real meaningful activities that review board is engaged in. Let's get some better media of these things. Let's get at least some summaries of radar data or undersea data or space monitoring data. Let's get some of the intelligence assessments out there. Let's get the fuller, currently classified version of the assessment on what the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac was, or the 2015 things off of the East Coast. Like, there are definitely intelligence assessments that got created around these. So we get some of that stuff out and some richer media. The amount of momentum we can then build on from those releases to next year get the eminent domain clause, I think it'll be a lot easier. We can look at it as kind of a staged progression, and that's, I think, a very tactical and mindful approach to continuing to make the focus progress. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say.
Well, I think what's interesting, too, about the intelligence assessment idea, one of the things that you hear time and time again is that sensor data cannot be released because that would reveal our sensor capabilities. So, you tell your friends, right? You tell your enemies. But an assessment can be provided where either sensor data is scrubbed or it's not even mentioned. You're simply publishing an assessment.
Just totally summarized. And I'll give you a couple concrete examples. So people are familiar with Avi Loeb and the Galileo Project. I spent a year with the Galileo Project. And one of the things that happened was that this was after Avi had started to talk about and write about the Oumuamua interstellar object that came through the solar system. He and one of his colleagues, Amir Siraj, actually one of his students at the time, started to look through data sets that talk about just meteorites coming through the atmosphere, which is something that we have multiple monitoring systems around. And they found one that, based on its characteristics, seemed like it might have actually had interstellar origin and then hit the ocean near Papua New Guinea. And they wanted some level of confirmation of the characteristics that they observed in the public data set that gave them the impression, the angle and the velocity made it look like this was not just something from our solar system that hit the Earth, but something that came in from outside of the solar system. And so they went to the government, and they went to the folks who have a lot of very secret stuff flying around both in space and also stationed on the ground that looks outward at space. And they said, can you confirm for us that specific object, here it is, this is the public data set that it correlates with, this was its name and the time and the location in this public science data set. Can you tell us, what can you tell us about this? And it's a perfect example. These are some of the most secretive systems that the government has that would be able to tell them whether that was an interstellar object or not. And so, of course, you would say, well, of course, they couldn't have answered Avi, right? Like, what could they tell him? But they did answer Avi. And they said, we can't give you the actual sensor data. We can't even give you some of the more specific data points that we captured. But they essentially offered an assessment or just highly summarized version of what the data actually showed. And they said, indeed, we can confirm that according to our data, this does appear to be at the velocity and angle that would, imply an interstellar object versus of more solar system origin. So that's the kind of data summary that seems entirely possible to get. Like, let's just take the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac. It's on the public record. The deputy director of ONI said the public and people understand the incident. He said, we have data on it, and it remains very difficult to understand and is unresolved. So multiple independent parties, including SCU, at least one other org, looked at the story and the timings and everything and figured out that Tic Tac looks like it moved from where Graves and the others kind of intercepted it, and then it zipped off to the cap point, and they were able to calculate it's somewhere between Mach 40 and Mach 50 that it like zipped to the cap point. So they don't have to release the raw radar data that says that, but they could just say radar data from, they don't even have to say where it comes from, but they could say the Princeton, because people know that the Princeton's radar was monitoring these objects. They could say Princeton's radar data indeed indicated that this object moved, we calculated between Mach 40 and Mach 50, between where it was seen by Commanders Fravor and others and the cap point. That doesn't reveal anything about that system's total capabilities. It doesn't tell us anything about how granular the data is. It could just confirm what they essentially already confirmed, but by really saying radar data from the area confirmed these performance characteristics. So I think in that form, we can expect to see some data, and we don't have to have them reveal sources and methods. The reality is with UAP, Matt, and I think you certainly know this, as do many of our viewers right now, when they say we need to protect sources and methods relating to UAP or relating to many other topics, they're often full of it.
Yeah.
Like that's often not
that's
actually what the situation is. Because they'll show us videos from like a near collision of like a US drone and a Chinese jet or whatever within a day. High resolution video. Most of the time the metadata is on the screen. They haven't even blocked out the little like on-screen displays. So all that metadata is like right there. And you're like, why can they show us that? We're talking about the same sensors, the same kind of readouts,
It's baloney. It's totally baloney. So as we mentioned, the UAP Disclosure Act of 2024 did not make it all the way through, but Senator Rounds and Schumer reintroduced it for basically a rounds 2, which is as I understand it, pretty much a word for word copy of what was introduced last year. Where are we currently in the process?
Well, we're at an important moment. Literally, my understanding, and we've talked about this a little bit, the next couple of weeks or so are going to be very critical. Even when Congress isn't in session, a lot of this stuff is kind of happening behind the scenes at the staffer level and other stuff. So there are a lot of moving parts even now. And that's why people being active right now is really important. So where we understand this to be, and this was actually validated by Rounds in a public statement, he's taking the lead role on the bill this year. Him and Schumer kind of toggled. So last year it was the Schumer Rounds, now it's the Rounds Schumer. And one hopes maybe for people who were triggered by Schumer's name being so associated with the bill, having a Republican at the head of it, hopefully maybe helps grease the wheels a little bit so it can move through a little more easily.
I didn't know that it had been changed. That I think is very smart.
Yeah, and it's like Rounds has been very publicly supportive of it, so I think that was a really smart move. And as you said, they really only have reintroduced the portions that didn't get passed last year, so it kind of properly subtracts out all of the NARA records repository stuff because that already is in the law. And what's going on now is that, and Rounds has said this, they're trying to get it included in the Senate's version of the NDAA. And I know that this is really like obscure government bureaucracy, but people really need to know how laws get made in this country, especially big laws like this, the NDAA, because it's a giant annual bill that gets passed covering most of defense and intelligence stuff. So the Senate and the House have their own versions of things. And for several years now, pretty much all of the meaningful UAP legislation has been coming from the Senate side. So the House has already passed their NDAA. And sadly, it didn't really have the UAP elements, including a UAPDA that was introduced by Rep. Garcia. It got stripped out. So like the House's version of the NDAA is bare of the UAP Disclosure Act. So the Senate hasn't passed their own version of the NDAA yet. They're in the process of figuring out everything that's going to get bundled into the Senate version. And then towards the end of the year, it's typically been in the December timeframe, the House and the Senate take their two bills, which each body has independently produced and passed at that point, and they have to do what's called reconciliation. They have to squish them together into one bill that is takes elements of one and the other, and it kind of creates a final bill that, again, the Senate will need to vote on and the House will need to vote on. And if both of the parties then can vote on the single reconciled bill, it goes up to the president to be signed into law. And again, for the NDAA, that typically happens in December. But we right now are really weeks away from the Senate deciding what their NDAA is going to look like. So they already passed kind of a preliminary version, but what they now need to do is kind of review all of the amendments that were put forth. And last year, the UAPDA was kind of put forth by the leader of the Senate, Schumer, I think as what's called a floor amendment. And it was just kind of voted in, and like it wasn't a big deal. I think it was like 87 or something to 13 who approved it. It's like a quick little vote, and it made it in. And that's how the UAPDA made its way into the Senate's version of the NDAA last year. Well, they're taking a slightly different tack this year. They're beginning with trying to actually get it introduced, the UAP Disclosure Act, as one of multiple amendments that become part of an amended version of the Senate NDAA that they call the manager's package. And Round said this. He says, we want to really try to get the UAPDA into the manager's package of amendments. They end up getting voted on as a block by the Senate, or especially by certain Senate committees, namely the Senate Armed Services Committee, Intel Committee. We understand that Homeland Affairs, Government Regulation and Homeland Affairs, or whatever it's called, also has a voice in that. But they want to try to take this manager's package approach, because I think what it will then signify is that there's even broader level, more institutionalized Senate support of the UAP Disclosure Act that has gotten it into the Senate's version of the NDA, so that when they get into the reconciliation process later this year, and it's the House folks and the Senate folks, in closed door sessions figuring out what's going to make it in, the Senate will be kind of coming into those conversations with more political capital behind them, because they can say, this has broad support. This was in the manager's package. This isn't even controversial in the Senate at this point. It's not something we quickly threw in there as a little rounding error. This was a negotiated part of what members of the Senate want to see in our NDAA, and we're not going to budge, and we want more of this in there. So I think it's a reasonable approach. Now, there's always the chance if it doesn't make it into the manager's package, maybe Rounds and Schumer can still put it forth kind of independently and squeeze it in, but we'll see. And I think the manager's package approach is really important. And that's why really this week, next week, this is like immediate time period we're now in. Everyone who's listening now should call their own senators. They can go to declassifyuap.org/action, fill out the form, take 30 seconds, send it. It'll hit your two senators. But then pick up the phone as a follow-up. Use our call tool that we have on the site, and then call the DC office, and we give you some talking points. Call the DC office of your two senators and say, I want to see the UAP Disclosure Act in the Senate manager's package for the NDAA. I want to see it in there. Have the UAPDA in the manager's package for the Senate FY25 National Defense Authorization Act. That is the primary message for your senators, because again, this is kind of a senatorial process that's taking place now. And then folks really should pick up the phone and call at least a handful of other key senators, even if they're not their own senators. They should call kind of both the head Republican and head Democrat of Armed Services, of the Senate Select Intel Committee, and again, the Government Affairs and Homeland Security, which is a voice in the NDAA. And frankly, if your senator is even in those committees at all, those three, blow them up, call the office. Again, reiterate, I want to see the UAPDA in the Senate manager's package for the FY25 NDAA. Again, all those talking points are just in the call tool. And we hope that pressure, and there was a lot of pressure last year. It's why we got the wins last year, and even for the years before. The public has been picking up the phones. They've been sending the messages. So they got to do this now. So this first hurdle of getting the UAPDA into the Senate's version of the National Defense Authorization Act happens in that manager's package, ideally. And then we can take a little breather for a couple of months. But then as we get closer to the end of the year, and they're actually kind of gearing up towards negotiating the final annual National Defense Authorization Act, then we got to pick up the phones again, do all the same reach outs, both on the House and Senate side at that point, and push for all of that to be in the final National Defense Authorization Act. So we've got like this immediate hurdle, and then we've got the end of the year of trying to get it in there.
Understood. And just to make sure I'm perfectly clear, the focus on the next 2 weeks is on the Senate. On the House side, that pressure needs to apply at the end of the year when everything is going into reconciliation.
Absolutely. Like, I think we'll want to put pressure on both the Senate and the House next year. But if this bill, the UAP Disclosure Act, makes it into the Senate manager's package, we'll now have 2 years worth of evidence that in the current Senate as it exists today, which is a Democrat-controlled Senate, with the people in those committees, being run by Democrats with a Republican as the second, we'll have 2 years worth of evidence that shows the Senate, in this formulation at least, can pass these bills. If the Senate changes hands, we don't know. And we have an election year before us, obviously, so anything could change. But at least in this current formulation, if it does make it into the manager's package, we have just ongoing evidence that the Senate isn't really the holdup to getting this level of UAP legislation passed. The trailing indicator is the House. It's getting the House people to stand up behind this and not just make noise, because everyone knows people in the House can make noise about issues. It's, can they pass meaningful legislation? Can they actually do their job as legislators? And unfortunately, the House that's existed for a couple of years now has not been as focused on getting things done. It's obviously a Republican-led House. There's been a lot of noise and a lot of bluster and government shutdowns. We might have a government shutdown in a few weeks. But we want to make the House members know that getting things done legislatively and doing it in a mature way, which the UAP Disclosure Act is what we want to see. So that's the pressure that we'll need to bring up at the end of the year. But right now, it's all focus on the Senate.
All focus all the time. Nick, thanks. Thank you very much for joining us. And again, how can the viewers at home find your site and utilize the tools that are on there?
They just go to declassifyuap.org/action, or you just click on the Action Center, fill out the form. The information is very private. It will, of course, be shared with your elected officials. But, as a constituent, and that's what declassifyuap.org is oriented around, is making your voice as a constituent for your own senators, your own House rep, giving you the mechanism to reach out to them. That's what the tool allows for. Now, I'm also going to plug UAPcaucus.com, which of course is an effort headed by Lester Nare and his colleague Ronak Patel. And UAPcaucus.com/call is also a very useful tool. It has its own call tool, and it's to allow American voters to reach out to a broader number of elected officials, including some of the key senators who are now involved in trying to get the UAPDA into the manager's package. So I really recommend, once you've used declassifyuap.org to reach out to your own reps as a constituent, go over to UAPcaucus.com/call and reach out to a few of the other key senators. Again, the folks on the Senate Intel Committee, Armed Services, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and let them know you want to see the UAP Disclosure Act in the Senate NDA manager's package.
Absolutely. I love that.
We make some real progress.
Yeah, and it's about time. We need to get this over the finish line, and the viewers at home, the American voters, they can do that. So, Nick, thank you very much for joining us, and even more so, thank you for your amazing efforts on this really important topic.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Matt, and I just want to thank you for being such a leading voice in rallying people around this cause. Treating it like a real political issue, frankly, a bipartisan one, which is really refreshing to have in this climate these days, that there's anything we can agree about, based on what our parties or our ideologies might be. I think most Americans, if they were asked, do you think the government should level with us about UFOs? Most Americans are going to say yes. Yes.
Absolutely.
And the good thing is our politicians know that. And that is, I think, the main thing that's behind the change that's taking place. We just got to be really loud and kind of cranky and stay on them until we get what we want. And again, what we want isn't the law, it's the information. It's the truth, whatever that is, to the best of their understanding. But the truth we deserve and we can handle. And that's what we need to just keep on them for until we get it.
I'm with you there, brother. I totally agree, as a certain congressman would say. All right, Nick Gold, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, well, folks, if you enjoyed our show, we would appreciate it if you would hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. Please tell your friends about us on social media. You can help grow the show, and more importantly, you can make a difference when it comes to UAP transparency. We will see you with more great guests on the Good Trouble Show.